In Taxi Driver, the main character Travis Bickle, a Vietnam War veteran, is on the verge of frenzy. Travis is trying to fit into society by getting a regular job, but because he doesn't really have the premier education to fit this ideal of an office job, he starts working as a taxi driver late at night to deal with his insomnia. Driving around the dangerous and dirty streets of New York City at night, he is a forgotten and ignored victim of the working class through the rise of capitalism in big cities. One day, he hopes to clean it all up and become the hero of the city.
All the animals come out at night. Someday a real rain will come and wash all this scum off the streets.
Travis feels lost by the city life, and after getting rejected by Betsy, he starts to cut and paste together what he believes is a masculine, heroic identity. He starts training like a soldier, handling guns like a cowboy, and dressing up like a veteran. All pop-cultural elements that form his idea of a hyper-masculine hero that'll be there for the people. But in reality, he starts to become ultra-violent and reckless. This hyper-masculinity is one that relies on ancient ideas of heroic behaviors, such as being a knight or cowboy that rescues princesses and fights the bad guys, which makes Travis live a life between fact and fiction.
Walking contradiction.
You saying that about me?
Who else would I be talking about?
Travis gets caught up in this duality of a man, which is slowly sending him down the wrong path. Travis, who's surrounded by impure and evil beings, becomes obsessed with saving a 12-year-old prostitute named Iris, because it is exactly the purity and innocence that he has lost that he is now trying to rescue and protect. Travis wants to leave his mark on this world. He has the opportunity to become a real hero as opposed to being only a faceless and imaginary one. In the end, his past, serving in the Vietnam War, combined with his insomnia, causes him to lose touch with reality and leads to his descent into madness. However, quite apart from social commentary and the thrill of psychology, there is an angle to the film that has probably not been explored a lot: the philosophical angle. The movie is bursting with references to existentialist texts written by famed authors such as Fyodor Dostoevsky, Jean-Paul Sartre, and Albert Camus. As these authors have made up a bulk of what I have been reading, I found it fascinating to connect the dots between the texts and the movie, and this video is an attempt at a philosophical analysis of the movie. But before going further, let's have a few words on existentialism. Existential philosophy is an extremely wide set of doctrines to be confined to one definition or a specific set of definitions. Rather, all existentialist authors have had their own interpretation and definition of it. For the sake of this video, I shall delve a little bit only into philosophies of authors which are relevant to the video: Dostoevsky, Sartre, and to a smaller extent, Camus. From among the many existentialist messages given by Dostoevsky in his books, the one recurring theme is that of individualism. Part of Dostoevsky's doctrine is the emphasis on self, and being authentic and true to the self. The self has to be accepted in all its ugliness and wretchedness, and blindly following broad ideologies which you yourself will be unable to accept will only cause you intense psychological torment. Sartre's existentialist tenets talk about the burden and responsibility that come with being a species gifted, or cursed, with free will. That man alone is responsible for his choices, and where those choices consequently lead him is at once a liberating and a crippling statement, and most of Sartre's fiction starred protagonists torn just between those two, liberating freedom and crippling depression. Another key tenet is the inherent meaninglessness of life, but of mankind's responsibility to find meaning in it by making their own choices. Let's start talking about the movie, and the philosophy will be expounded upon a lot more in the context of the movie and the parallels it draws with two particular works of fiction. Existentialist characters in Dostoevsky's and Sartre's fiction have many common traits. The existentialist feels superior to other beings and looks down upon them because he alone understands the inherent meaninglessness of things that other common people strive for. The existentialist's knowledge of the bleakness of the world puts them on a pedestal inside their own mind and often brings them to loathe and despise their fellow mankind. Now think about Travis's monologues at various points in the movie, where he refers to the nocturnal inhabitants of New York City as scum of the earth several times, and when he shouts at Betsy that she's just like the rest of them and will rot in hell, being just two examples out of many. Travis isn't shown to be a religious fanatic, yet his imperious judgment of others based on how he perceives them is clear. This is again something consistent with existential philosophy, given that several devout Christians and atheists have been proponents of existentialism. His relationships with Betsy, a clerk in a politician's office, and Iris, an underage prostitute, while ill-defined, clearly come from a place of moral high ground on Travis's part. He wants to save these women from drudgery and prostitution, respectively, not as a fellow human being, but as someone who is much above them, not very different from perceiving himself as a god trying to save the hapless by smiting the wicked, which he also does. All this is much more than indicative of Travis's perceived superiority to the rest of the society. Writing a diary religiously, shunning other drivers' company, taking a woman out on a first date to an adult movie, Travis is quite clearly unable to think from a perspective different from his own. This is, yet again, a very common trait with existentialist characters in novels. They are supremely self-obsessed because of their feeling of superiority. Add in their belief in the meaninglessness of human relationships, and reading about the extreme alienation that these characters feel from society is akin to living at a depth of 30,000 feet underwater. Who does isolation of that kind leave you with? Yourself, of course. And the self becomes the overwhelming center of attention of these characters. That is, again, quite keenly portrayed in the movie, and is another existentialist theme that pervades the movie. As a result of the superiority and the self-obsession, Travis firstly shuns any kind of human relationships, and when he tries to build one, he finds it extremely difficult. One example has already been mentioned earlier, his date with Betsy, where he takes her to an adult movie, which turns out to be a total disaster. In more than one scene, Travis is shown shunning the company of fellow drivers while sitting with them at a diner. Another example is when Betsy dumps him, he tries to talk things out with Wiz, another driver who works for the same company as Travis. Travis, though, can't even articulate what he's feeling. All he can say is, "I feel real down." Even his relationship with Iris is centered around one thing: saving her from her predicament. Travis's difficulty in forming relationships with other people is somewhat reminiscent of Meursault from Camus' The Stranger, and the Underground Man from Notes from Underground. Several of Dostoevsky's works underline the importance of being true to self. But the first step in being honest with the self is acknowledging the self for both the good things and the bad things. And thinking about your own faults, shortcomings, and focusing on your dark side can be quite a crippling experience. Nobody portrays this better than the underground man in Dostoevsky's Notes, who accepts that he is a wretched human being who takes pleasure in inflicting pain and humiliation on others, and with this realization is utterly crippled from ever doing anything good, even if the desire to do that good has originated in his heart of its own accord, without any ulterior motive. In Taxi Driver, the wretchedness of existence is instead shown in other people rather than in Travis himself. Think about the pimps, the druggies, a 12-year-old girl who prostitutes herself and smokes pot, and is moreover a victim of Stockholm Syndrome and in love with her kidnapper, the pimp. Existence doesn't get more depressing than this. The camera thoroughly explores the dark side of humanity via Travis's viewpoint, and Taxi Driver is a stark portrait of the worst things about mankind. One way of looking at Travis's crime is that it is born of anger. Much like in Erostratus, a short story by Jean-Paul Sartre, Travis fails in killing his first target, the senator for whom Betsy had worked, and then ends up shooting someone else entirely. Actually, a bunch of people. But the point is, Iris and her pimp were nowhere near his thoughts, or at least it wasn't shown. while he shaved his head and prepared himself to take a life. It might have been a rage crime, born out of frustration of the failed attempt on the senator's life. If the final scene of the movie was indeed a reality and not a dying Travis's imagination, then the city has just adulated a killer who murdered 3 people in a blind rage. Regardless of the effects, Iris getting her freedom. It's an interesting ethical dilemma, but the point stands. Also think about the horror that same society would have recoiled with, had Travis's initial plan of murdering the senator succeeded. Erostratus, a short story by Jean-Paul Sartre, focuses on a man who is dedicated to hating humanity. He looks down upon mankind as he would upon insects. Needless to say, he wishes to quash them under his heel. This man procures a gun and decides to murder 6 random people, 1 each for every bullet in the revolver, and is exhilarated by the sense of masculinity and power that he derives from the gun. So much so that despite being impotent, he hires a prostitute and asks her to pleasure herself and parade around naked in front of him. However, he fails out of a lack of nerve to kill the first person he highlights, and runs away in a blind panic, instead killing off a random person. Notes from Underground, a classic by Dostoevsky, features a man who goes to a brothel, drunk, and instead tries to help his hired prostitute escape by outlining how terrible her life would be in a few years. He invites her to his place, but eventually ends up betraying her horribly because of his crippling sense of being unable to do anything good. Gun, prostitute, hatred of humanity. Sounds at least partly familiar? This is the one point that is probably the most coincidental out of all of these. The senator portrayed in the movie is forever proclaiming, "We are the people," and how he would go about doing things that were in the favor of the majority, how the few would no longer rule as they wanted. At its most basic level, I interpret that as a form of socialism. And the interesting part is, Dostoevsky hated socialism and socialists, hated them with a passion. The fact that Travis's initial target, for reasons that were probably not political, admittedly, was a socialist, seemed to me to be the subtlest doff of the hat by the writers to Dostoevsky, from whose book the story seemed to borrow so much. Might not be true, but it was a fun fact that jumped out at me at the end. There's so much more to write about and analyze in this film. A prostitute being the central character that caused the mayhem at the end, entirely without any fault of her own, the contradictions that Travis is filled with. And yet, I feel it's better to pause here,